All right, it is November 8th. It is, at least in California, it's the first day after daylight savings time switched. So, first weekday anyways. Hopefully that didn't screw up too many people. Um, but yeah, happy November 8th. Keep on moving along here. There's a few gaps up for discussion today. I think that's all that's on the roadmap. I want to thank Shane because I'd asked him if there's any chance he could get something together this week, and he did, which is awesome for the L4 matching gap that he's been working on. We have a couple that are going to come up next week, so anything that we could get in earlier was great. So I think we've got a draft from him that we can go over today. And then there's just some follow-up on some existing gaps that are, I think, in their final phases, but we'll see. So without further ado, let's get into, and as always, feel free to add to this agenda at any point. But yeah, with that, let's get into the path rewrite and redirect gap. There have been a few changes over the past week. And I would say the main one here is that there were two supported path replacement types. One was absolute, where you would just replace the entire path with the given value, and the other was prefix. But as got some feedback and comments, as much as prefix is fairly broadly supported, if we ever wanted to extend it, it would get quite messy. You can imagine that if you have a path that specifies a prefix match and an exact match, but you only replace the prefix match, then it gets messier than I would like. So instead, have renamed that in the past week and redefined it to just be replace path match. That unfortunately is going to be a little bit harder to define conformance-wise. I think extended is about as good as we can do here, but it does give us a lot more flexibility going forward. So I'd say that's one of the biggest changes that's happened in the past week on this gap. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight is, well, related to that, field type level conformance, right? And I think, Harry, you had some comments about how messy conformance could potentially get here. But what I'm really describing here is, a potential mess where an implementation can support replacing a prefix of a path, but they can't support replacing a regex match, as an example. And in that case, you have this kind of complex conformance to define. I think it's entirely possible to define it, but it does mean that instead of implementations either support this feature or they don't, they support portions of this feature. I think that's a reasonable way to go, but I just wanted to highlight that downside of this approach. I've talked a bunch about these two things. Does anyone want to jump in? Do you have thoughts on, well, specifically this rename, this redefinition of how we replace path matches, or second, this kind of messy conformance that we're potentially getting into?
It feels like there's prior art for slightly messy conformance in that way with ingress, where you have this exact situation where certain types of path matching are implementation specific. You probably know the ingress thing better than I do, Rob.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. I think this is not completely new territory, and I feel like it is unfortunately inevitable with the kind of API we're trying to build here. I can't think of another alternative other than just, well, if not everyone supports it, we just won't do it, which is really kind of what we're trying to avoid with this API. So I think since we are trying to provide this kind of consistent way to express more advanced functionality, this is probably the way to go.
I
So-
mean, go ahead.
Go ahead, Harry.
Thanks. So I do see, like, there is like I do see how it is related to ingress, and and there is some prior art in ingress, but I don't think that's a completely fair comparison, because ingress is like a fairly straightforward API. There's just like one thing that we have in there is like path match type, I think, and in this API you have like a gateway, then a route, and then you have a filter which also has a conformance, and then filter itself has a conformance, and then within that we are talking about fields, right? So we already have this, so we are not increasing the problem, but we have to be careful when we introduce these things, because as a user, the user will be like, okay, I need to redirect, and they'll be just configuring that. They won't go and read our documentation or do any, like, things will just stop working for them, and it's very hard for them to get any feedback on these things, is my concern. So go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something sort of complementary to that. There's always going to be cases, I think, as we try to get more complex, where controllers aren't going to support, some field, like even regexes, right? There was a long thing in Ingress about, well, what flavor of regexes do we have to do? Implementations have to support. So maybe we need to think about like a standardized way for controllers to say, I didn't support this thing. So when you do your replace your path prefix match field, then maybe we can think about a way to express the fact that it failed in a standardized way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think that extends beyond just this gap, but it relates in some sense to some of the conformance discussions that we've been having in parallel here, that we need this kind of consistent way to represent, and I don't think it needs to be limited to a specific feature or field, but more generally that controllers need to be able to, or implementations need to be able to clearly document what they support. And then second, when they see configuration that they don't understand, there should be a clear and consistent way to communicate that. That feels like it can be, and probably should be, more generic than, for any one field, feature, etc.
Yeah, I can probably take an action to try and spec a status condition for that.
Yeah, I was about to say it sounds like a condition to me. I think there's two parts to this. There's that we do need to consider at some point. I mean, I spent some time thinking about this already, but like that's how do you specify the conformance bits? So, and which is sort of two sub things of that, which is how do you make it so that the conformance tests know what test to run? And then how does the controller expose something to the user that tells them what things they can use? I kind of tend to lean towards having something on the gateway class for the controller of the implementation that tells you about the extended features that are supported, or the features that are supported more generally. Then you can use that for the testing as well, to key the testing, to make sure that, and then the test, the tests get turned on or off based on those things. And then the other side to that is the user side. That is, if you use a feature that your implementation doesn't support, how do we expose that to the user in such a way that they'll see it easily? And that, I think, is the condition flow, James, that I think we should focus on in this case. That the condition is like, you used a feature that I don't support, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's probably really hard I think it'll be really hard for implementations to specify their full set of conformance in a way that people in the documentation so people can read it.
Yeah, I think that that's got to be machine consumable. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be complicated enough that it's not going to be easily human passable. But if it's machine consumable, then you can have tools that will test if if you want to move between implementations. You can be like, here's the source gateway, here's the target gateway, what ones are going to work, and it should be reasonably straightforward to do that sort of test, so that you'll know ahead of time, as well, or even if it is machine consumable as well, there's other things you can do. And the other option is, of course, that you can just have a route point to two gateways, and then because the status is namespaced by the implementation that is pointing to that gateway, then you can have the conditions on there that say, hey, I don't support these things. I think that's really important to remember with routes, is that the status is namespaced by the gateway that it points to.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think because we already have that capability in routes, like you're pointing out, I think route gateway status is what we call it, something like that. Adding a condition at that point is going to be relatively straightforward. So yeah, that seems like a very good takeaway, and something that applies more broadly than just this one gap, but something that we definitely need to create a follow-up for. So James, did I hear you correctly that you're okay with volunteering to lead a gap on that or something like that?
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks.
And then
go ahead.
And then on the replace path prefix to replace path match, is it possible to introduce like another implementation specific match within this like replace type or whatever we call it?
What would that? Yeah, so I think I must have misunderstood your comment or suggestion. I tried to respond in the issue, but what kind of implementation specific replacement would, like, what kind of use cases would that be?
So like one use case that comes to mind is, regular expression substitutions. So this is like your foo bar, and then you have a regex capture group, and you do substitution based on like $1/foo. And
Okay.
yeah, there are like these things that I have seen. I don't know how common they are, but I have observed them.
Yeah, regex substitution is, I would agree, it is fairly common. I would almost prefer building that in as a extended mechanism over reusing implementation specific, because when we got into implementation specific, there was we ran into the issues of, well, there's only one implementation specific and it can mean something completely different depending on the implementation. That seeming more confusing than, say, a vendor prefix name or actually, bringing the feature to extended support.
I mean, regular expressions are not extended support from what I read, right? Like, because there are different engines and whatnot. So
fair. That's fair. Yeah. But so I guess, yeah, extended was not the right term there, but elsewhere we have regex matching. And based on that regex matching, we call it implementation specific, but it's built into the API. It's not literally an implementation specific matching type name. We call it regex, and then we say that the implementation of this regex is implementation specific, which, yeah, the terminology there is confusing, but that may have been what you were describing here as well.
Yeah, I mean, practically, even though we have regular expressions like defined as like, a match type, it is not portable across implementations. So the user still has to, see, okay, is the regex engine same? Okay, is this regex doing the same thing in another implementation? So from a user's perspective, it feels like it's implementation specific, right? Like it's just that there is a way to specify that, okay, this is a regex and not like some funky value.
I'd
there a
say
way to-
that, or go ahead.
Oh, just wondering if there's maybe a way for something like regex. It feels fairly straightforward because it's kind of like there are a few options to pick from, something like a enum-ish annotation on that field rather than just like a Boolean like supported or not, to like add a qualification of its PCRE regex or whatever other kind of regex the specific implementation supports. But like maybe for less well-defined stuff like a vendor note kind of thing, I don't know how practical that is.
Yeah, I think that the point that Harry made is pretty fair. Like, if you think of it in terms of conformance, how would you, and we do have a regex match or a regex replace that is, that has extended conformance. That means part of what extended conformance means is that we have upstream available at the end of the day, is that ideally we should have upstream available tests for that extended functionality that mandate that everybody who supports that extended functionality does it in the same way. Because of what Harry said and what and what Mike was referring to, like it's not really possible to do that unless you have something that says this is the flavor of regex that we're talking about. So, and I feel like I think your points are fair, Mike, but I feel like having something where it's like they'll let you specify the flavor of regex that you're talking about, like that's a lot of additional API for something that's always going to be a bit fiddly no matter what you do.
Yeah.
Or maybe, I may have misunderstood, but maybe what you were suggesting was a way for implementations to describe the flavor of regex they supported, not necessarily adding new fields to the API for users to specify different kinds of regex.
Oh, sorry. Yes. It was not suggested to be user specified, but rather the API advertise what flavor they're conforming to.
Yeah. And I think that lines up pretty nicely with what Nick has been describing of a way for gateway classes to programmatically describe what they support. That's something that has been kind of a long-term ongoing discussion here. And the flavor of regex is likely going to be true for the entire implementation, not just a specific protocol or route or whatever. And so in that sense, it probably does make sense to bubble that all the way up and include that in that discussion. Nick, is that kind of in scope for what you were describing?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think so. It would make sense for it to be able to say, hey, if there's any references to regex, this implementation does PCRE or whatever. And then the good part then is that you can say, the following regex types are extended support and have tests for them. And any other ones are implementation specific support and don't have tests. That in my mind is one of the biggest benefits of conformance testing. Is that if you could do something like that and describe things in that way, then you can always be confident you have a test that tests the things that have extended. And that's, I think, what we should be aiming for. Everything that's core has mandatory tests. Everything that extended has optional tests, but we do provide tests. Everything that's implementation specific, we don't provide tests. You're on your own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd say also another benefit of this kind of approach is if you're really just looking at a cluster at the gateway classes in your cluster, you can kind of surmise gateway classes that might be portable. Like these 5 gateway classes all support the same flavor of regex and the same subset of features that I'm using. So I should be able to go between them pretty easily. Whereas this one doesn't support this that I really care about or whatever, or I need to translate to a different kind of regex when I move to, none of this is ideal, but I think it makes it a little bit easier to process if you have that all described in a central place.
Yeah, I think
Cool.
I think there's a bunch of stuff there that we can talk about. Like there's some discussion in the chat about, what generates the, I don't support that thing, but I think there's a bunch of stuff there that we can talk about where that information comes from and how it gets set up and all that sort of stuff. But I think that feels like something that will go in the actual conformance design gap. The one that I did earlier was I would call it a memorandum of understanding that we want to have conformance done in something like that. Whereas then we need to actually have a design for how the conformance will work.
Yeah, makes sense.
So going back, like, so what's like the decision? What's being like between replace path prefix match and replace path match? Where are we with that? I couldn't understand that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it back on track. Well, onto this original question, and I had thought I probably misunderstood, and I'll open it up. But my understanding was that this was a supported change or a reasonable change. But if anyone has hesitation about this change, this would be a great time to bring that up. I may have misunderstood discussion here.
So just for another level of clarity, when you say replace path match, and if it is a regular expression match, then it will substitute everything that is selected by the regular expression as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that would be implementation specific behavior. Unfortunately, I mean that's regex by definition is implementation specific behavior, but maybe we do need a little bit more specification around how we recommend that work. Regex is one that's hard to really represent this way, admittedly.
Okay, and I see, but
Can we
go ahead.
not just say, hey, use PCRE? LOL.
That would be nice, but unfortunately, the underlying implementations of whatever vendor will only support a given flavor of regex in most cases. So if like many of these controllers, you're just programming another data plane, then you don't really have that choice to make often.
So in that case, let's say we do replace path match and only define the behavior for path prefix matches, and everything else is undefined. Is that a good place to be?
Yeah, it's not great. I would clarify that technically it's straightforward to provide clear behavior for path prefix and exact matches, but exact matches you're going to get nearly identical behavior to absolute path replacement. The thing this enables, at least theoretically, is that it enables you to write this one filter and have it applied to two separate matches at the same time, say a exact match and a prefix match, which was currently not possible with the very specific, I will only replace path prefix matches kind of thing.
It feels like the downside of having to do two things at once is and I think the reason why we veered into the extended conversation about regex is that if we keep it as replace path prefix match, you have to have, like, if you want to replace the prefix and like an exact match, then you've got to have two filters, like replace path prefix match, replace path exact match. Yeah. But the plus side of that is that then we can say a filter of type replace path regex match is implementation specific or extended support, whereas replace path prefix match and replace path exact match are core support or something like that, and lets you define the conformance at the filter type level rather than at a field level inside the filter.
Yeah.
So it feels like that's the trade-off we're making there. I don't know which way I fall on that off the top of my head. I feel like I need to think about it some more. my initial reaction is it feels like more like doing it via filter type feels like it would be more explicit and more, it's easier to do conformance and easier to make it portable. The other way feels a little bit too magic, but it is, the downside of that is that it's going to be more verbose.
Yeah, well, so to clarify, this all falls within a filter type of request redirect or request rewrite. And then within that, you have a replay path type, I think it is. I'll go back to the gap to be 100% sure. But that's roughly where this lies. I can't type today. But anyways, with that, yeah, so this is really where we're talking about changing the value. So it's not clear if you had, say, multiple filters of type request rewrite. What you're describing, I think, is possible. You have two request rewrite filters. One replace path match, the other replace, one path prefix match, the other replace exact path match and regex path match, etc. That's possible, but again, it's unfortunately not filter level support. It's kind of buried down under there. Maybe I should pull these all out into separate filters of that are, instead of a single one for rewrite and a single one for redirect, there can be subsets that all make up smaller filters. I'm not sure on that, but that is a possible interpretation of this.
I think that would be a very engineering solution. Like, it's a very engineering heavy solution, where the user has to make so many choices. Again, if for the core filter, I think we should aim to solve for 80% of the use cases. I think that would be success.
Yeah. So I hadn't looked at it properly for a while. So I think, yeah, given that you have the filter type to be like a request rewrite or request request redirect, and then the path is like a thing inside that. Yeah, like it. I think, as Harry said on a comment on the thing, that we've got multiple layers of conformance difference, right? Like, like the filter itself is maybe core conformance, but then there's extended fields inside the filter, which is like a microcosm of the same problem that we have where the HTTP route, or the gateway object is core conformance, but there are fields inside it that are extended conformance. So I don't think there's much way that we're ever going to get around the fact that we have, like, the conformance is kind of fractal, that that some objects within some objects are going to be core conformance. I'm making air quotes, but they're going to have bits that are not conformant.
Yeah, this is a messy one. I've gone back and forth on it, and I spent most of the time just advocating for prefix match here, and I am entirely fine with going back to just prefix match here. What eventually scared me away from this is if we, if we end up in a place where we end up with, replace prefix match only applies to prefix matches up here, and if you have an exact match or if you have something else, then you've got to express that this other way, and that it felt like it would be something we would regret in the future. But at the same time, this is sufficiently complicated that we could regret making it so wide open. I'm not sure.
I think supporting prefix and exact is good enough. Like, if that's the most that we should do, and not worry about other use cases. So, and if you only start with prefix, I think that will still be fine, because exact comes as part of prefix. So.
Is it fair then to say, to leave this name, and as we define replace path match, note that it is incompatible with regex matching?
can we say the behavior with regex matching is undefined and up to the implementation?
That's fair.
Yeah, so I guess the way to say that is that so because this is you have the type replace path match, but then you have a value. It feels like we'd need to if we were to say write API validation for if we were to write API validation for the value field, it has to allow the regex meta characters in that case. And we say, okay, the regex meta characters are allowed, but having it be a regex makes the support of this implementation specific or something.
Okay.
That sounds
Yeah,
confusing.
or go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, just that sounds potentially confusing.
I'm confused right now, so yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to monopolize all the time with this PR because there are other conversations potentially more important than this one on the agenda. So there's a lot more to discuss here. I'll play around with it some more. It's interesting for anyone watching the recording after John saying this is a remarkably popular feature request for Istio. So good to have that as background that people do want regex rewrite support, at least for some implementations.
Yeah, we've definitely heard regex rewrite requests for Contour as well.
Okay.
It's particularly so. Another thing that is important to remember that if you do, if you allow rewrites on things that have route inclusions, and you can stack the rewrites up at different inclusion levels, then things can get extremely confusing.
That sounds awful.
Yes.
Yeah, good point.
So,
yes.
That is why we don't do it in Contour, is that the HTTP proxy document defines inclusion can define inclusion in terms of path prefixes. But if you allow a regex match in there, then deciding what gets included and what gets doesn't becomes like a horrifying nightmare.
Yeah.
So there is this other side to it. As a user, also using regex can lead to incredibly painful outages and routing issues. So it's not just like implementers have issues, it's also like using it in the right places with right powers is very hard.
Right.
You can't parse a regex just by looking at it, Harry. Like,
I have yet to write a single bug-free regex in my career, like a single bug-free regex.
I 100% agree. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well,
regex is huge for gun potential, no matter what you do.
I agree with that. It makes me scared of all our CRD validation that's using regex now, but it's another thing. So yeah, let me move on from this. This is PR 731. There's not that many open PRs right now. I'd love to continue this conversation on the PR. If anyone has thoughts, I'm not quite sure how I want to approach the next change here, but I hope to have an update out in the next day or two based on this conversation or any feedback I get on the PR. So if you have thoughts, continue discussion here in Slack, wherever's easiest. We can go from there. But with that, I want to switch gears because Shane has a great draft going of what this route matching could look like for L4 routes. And I will just, Shane, I think you're still on the call.
Nope.
Yeah. Oh, all right, perfect. So maybe you can introduce what you were thinking here.
Sure. So this is based on issue 735. In 735, it was originally kind of requested to do like destination matching, although the question of why not do source matching came up. So for the purposes of this draft, so far I'm actually going with doing both, but I've intentionally, and I've mentioned it in the non-goals, dropped source ports. So at Kong, we see use cases for all the other ones, source addresses and then destination addresses and ports, but source ports is a little we don't see a case for it really yet. So I'm just leaving it out of this because it's something we can add later once we see cases and kind of understand better what we need it for. The long and short of it, if you scroll down, is adding 2 types to the API, a network match and a traffic match. And what I'm suggesting is instead of just, for matching ports, it's more or less just using the existing port number. But for matching addresses, I had this sense that it could very easily become something beyond, just a single IP address that you would actually want to match on. So I intentionally wrapped address inside of network match with if you scroll down, with the kind of growth room for things like maybe you want to add a mask and say you actually want to do an entire subnet for this match. But that's not actually what I'm suggesting we do as part of this spec, just pointing out to kind of leave the room open for later to do things like that. So network matches are part of a traffic match, which you can go down to. And the long and short of it is a traffic match goes inside of a route rule as the match for destinations. And you have source addresses, destination addresses, and destination ports, just lists of network matches or port numbers. And they do the thing. So it's pretty straightforward. And I could have made it even simpler, but I did feel like the need for a little bit of growth room later so that we weren't so locked into like strings when we could have types that could have more options later was important. It's very drafty. This was literally the first draft that I posted, and Rob's like, hey, we'll talk about it tonight. And I'm like, okay. So.
No, I think this is really great. I'm excited to get this discussion going. I think this is something that we've really needed to extend our capabilities on L4. And I really like, like you say, this is the first draft of the proposal. I think this is a really good starting point. And I'm just interested. I've looked through it just briefly here, but I'm interested in what others, think of this approach. If it seems useful for your implementations. I know we have a number of L7 implementations that this may not be as relevant to, but if you have L4 use cases, I'm very interested in if this makes sense.
So one thing that
Yeah, I guess I should point out that.
Sorry, continue, Shane.
No, I was just pointing out that we do want the ones that are actually there are things that we do actually want. This is what we would potentially want to actually use. So this isn't coming from a place of like no background. We have use cases for end users in this in L4. So go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that jumped out at me with the traffic matching syntax is we should take a look at Kubernetes network policy, and maybe we can make the field grammar look similar, so that we don't have to express this, so that when people are trying to do this stuff, they can reuse the idioms and language that they've used in network policy in gateway policy as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll put a note down to take care of that for next week, and I'll take a look. It's good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I like the look of it. It looks cool. I think leaving a slot to have a mask is a very good idea, because and I'm pretty sure that that's how network policy works. So Rob, you probably know better than I do again. I have never seen anything where treating a single IP address as a subnet with a 32 network mask was not the simplest way to do single IPs.
Roger that.
Cool, great feedback all around. And somehow I had missed a suggestion, but it's a great one to try and line this up with network policy API, because this is very similar. Initially when I started talking about this, it seemed, oh yeah, this is in a different world, but you're right. This proposal lines up very closely with what the network policy API covers, at least in terms of what you can configure.
I have some vague memory that there's people are working on a next generation network policy.
They
Yeah,
are,
Is
yeah.
that-
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go in Slack, there's a SIG network policy API channel that, so same as us, just they started maybe 6 months after this working group, but there's another working group going that's working on the next generation of network policy.
Yeah, I was active in policy like 8 months ago, but I'll need to catch up on the new spec.
They conveniently have a time that's exactly, I think, like right now. Right,
2
like, I
hours
know
ago,
it-
actually.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
it's-
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
2 hours past. I sometimes go to it. I haven't been to it in a while, but it all makes sense to kind of start going there. And I can talk to Jay about this a little bit if I have any questions.
Yeah, it's been on my calendar and I always say I'm going to go and I haven't been for way too long, but one of these days.
The problem is you go and then they ask you to work on Windows and you're like, no,
Yes. Exactly.
it's a
So
joke,
what?
just a joke. I'm kidding.
Yeah. What sort of conformance are we looking at here?
Good question. I feel like this sort of stuff is pretty common for anything that's doing layer 4, personally.
Like within conformance. This is very tightly bound, even though I had lots of ideas about different directions it could go. So much so that I didn't even touch like source ports, even though I could come up with, stuff for that. I don't even know if that would be something we'd want in core. But suffice to say, what's there, if I'm understanding how we want to do conformance correctly, what's there, I think all is very easily testable. And the expansions to what is now called network match would just need to be kind of, kept very confined and constrained.
Yeah, I think it feels to me like this
Or
is
get extended
absolutely
subtypes.
like all of this feels like at least extended, if not core. And then the with the adding the masking would then be a good test, Rob, of the our versioning policy and how we do and how we handle that.
Yep. I agree with that. And I'm really curious. We need to spend a bit of time looking through potential implementations of this API to see if we could get some of these to core. I feel like there's potential for some of these to be core, but at the very least, like Nick said, extended seems very reasonable.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I was kind of like looking at core when I thought about it, but maybe I was overreaching a little bit.
I think these are awfully close. I need to.
They're right on the line, aren't they?
Yeah. Cool. Well, this actually, I feel like this is awfully close. I'm excited to get this one and get this discussion going. Shane, I guess the next step is to turn this into a PR whenever you're comfortable with it, and we can continue the discussion there.
Yeah, I'll probably just start doing that next and start actually throwing together an implementation.
Great. Well, thanks for taking this one on. Cool. And next week, it sounds like we may have some follow-ups on this gap. And then Jeff is also planning to get proposals together for route inclusion and delegation to discuss next week as well. And with that, I think the last gap on the agenda is Gateway API versioning. This one is one that dates back to last week. We've already discussed it. I think the updates have been relatively minimal. Good feedback all around, lots of comments and discussion, but most of this has been what I would call tweaks or clarifications, nothing groundbreaking in terms of changes. I think the biggest thing I wanted to highlight is this ongoing thread and discussion about, well, this comment. Actually, let me just open up the full thing, because basically what we're saying and we've had this discussion, but that any validation we provide, whether it's through a webhook or CRD annotations, is not something that can be truly relied on as a security mechanism, because anything we do as API authors can be bypassed. You can modify a CRD, you can delete a webhook, you can whatever, if you have that level of access. Admittedly, those are both pretty elevated levels of access, but if they enable you to further elevate your access by, basically, telling a controller to do something like it really shouldn't do, or, taking advantage of access that a controller might have that you otherwise wouldn't have, it represents a vulnerability. So this is really just trying to cover that concept that anything we do is fundamentally limited. And unfortunately, that means that we need to rely on implementations to implement some form of local validation if they truly want to be secure. So there's a thread that goes on about how we can find the right balance. Harry correctly added this to our issue tracking all the many frustrations of being out of tree and not, and working with CRDs. Hopefully some of those can be fixed upstream eventually. And then I added another tracking issue, and that's based on this set of comments here, right? That it could be useful if we're saying that all implementations really should be doing some set of validation locally on resources to ensure they're not introducing some kind of security risk, they're not, whatever. Maybe we can share that code. Maybe that can live in OSS. So that we're not relying on every controller to reinvent the same wheel, because we're fundamentally talking about the same set of validation. So I created a tracking issue to work on some kind of shared validation like this. Yeah, that's a summary of this discussion. I wanted to highlight this because I know not everyone's been involved in this discussion, and I also wanted to give anyone an opportunity to give some input if this feels reasonable. If there are any better alternatives than this kind of shared validation package, if we're being too restrictive by saying that the validation we're writing can't really be trusted. And any thoughts, comments, whatever on this, I'm interested to continue the discussion here.
Is there any prior art at all?
I think we are, fortunately or unfortunately, paving the way on this one. There's plenty of prior art with CRDs, but it seems like not many that really have gone to the depths that we've gone and have the shared set of implementations like we're trying to do here. So I think we're the first that are trying to solve this particular problem, but I could be wrong. I think someone mentioned, maybe it was you, Harry, had mentioned that we should bring this up to SIG-Arch or API machinery just to ensure that we're not missing anything obvious. But I think that's all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't have any other solution than the one being presented right now. So.
Yeah, I don't either, but I think that it is, if we are going to say, it feels like if we are going to do this, the only way to do it safely and in a fair way for everybody is to say there is an upstream validation package. Part of the contract for any implementation is that you must run the validation on every object when you ingest it, and reject the object if it fails the validation.
Yeah.
And that means that then it's quite straightforward to include, are you validating these things in the straightforward but wordy in the conformance tests. There would basically be a set of tests that would test that you are validating, that you correctly using the validation code we supply you.
Yeah.
And in terms of
go ahead.
In terms of implementation, can it be like as simple as like figuring out a package to take take a CRD from the API server and run the same validation that the API server runs based on the CRD definition and the open API, whatever thingies that are in there. And that's it, so we don't even have to write code for the most
That'd be
part.
really nice, but yeah,
Yeah,
that feels like some deep magic, to be honest.
it does feel like something that has to be theoretically possible by importing the upstream packages that already do this. But I'd have to do some digging. But this actually goes into my next question here, and that is, and I struggled with this, and I'm not sure how this impacts our versioning plan. But one of the ideas in versioning is that we want to be able to introduce future API versions that loosen validation in some way. And obviously we can't predict what that loosened validation is going to be or going to look like. But there are some things where we maybe could, my perspective on this shared validation package is to try to restrict security risks, to restrict potential vulnerabilities. But yeah, as a rough example, the difference of a max length of 12 and a max length of 100 is probably minimal in terms of security and more just this is kind of a safeguard. I'm not sure if we want to differentiate at all, but if we do lock in implementations to basically implementing their own validation based on the bundle version they support, we have this risk of making the version support stricter than we need to. We allowed longer names now, but because my implementation was built with v0.4.0, it will completely ignore any resource that has longer names or drop it or whatever, because it's built in. Imported validation says that's not valid. That's a bit of an extreme case, but that's just one of the things as I've just been starting to process what a shared validation package could look like. I've had some concerns about how it could potentially limit interoperability, right, between different versions.
Yeah, I think this I have a similar comment on this PR as well, where since we are saying that new versions can loosen things or introduce fields and whatever, an implementation could choose to only say like, okay, we support these bundle versions specifically, and if there are other bundle versions installed, they fail whatever, like the implementation has the choice to do that, right? Because think the way I have been processing this, let's say you have a new version X+1 and the version X and an implementation was programmed against version X. To write code in order to be completely resilient with anything that can change in X+1, it's not anything. We are drawing down a subset. To definitively say that does not introduce any security risk is challenging, especially given that the surface is pretty large, relatively large. So does it make sense that implementations like say that, okay, we support bundle X, Y, and Z versions, and we don't support G+1, but we will in future?
I mean, that makes sense to me, and kind of like the case where I think of where there could be like an actual risk is something like the difference between like allowing a string to include a regex match, where that's something that you don't necessarily want to just allow if the spec gets looser, without the implementation explicitly opting into it.
Yeah, that's a good point. We do have to be careful here. I was hoping that we had sufficient guardrails that we wouldn't have to be quite that restrictive, but the safest the safest thing for any implementation to do is always going to be to just support what they know and nothing more. That is unfortunate though, because it limits if controller A supports a subset of versions and controller B supports a different subset, and those subsets are so narrow, it makes this API more challenging to use. This does require some more thought, and we'll learn as we go as far as what is really safe in terms of an upgrade process. I'm hoping these guardrails keep changes pretty safe, but
yeah, the reason for that, like my apprehension to not making having explicit version compatibility is, let's say you lose on any validation, like Mike gave a good example. It probably wouldn't highlight a bug on the surface, but it could open up, it might be configuring the implement, let's say you lose on it to regex match, and everything's still working fine, but it is opening up a security hole, because that loosened validation wasn't tested against, right? So at the end of the day, it's unexpected mode of running software. So that's where, even if hard failure is not good for the end user, that okay, one cloud provider is running X version of this bundle version and the implementations are not catching up. But I think we do have to rely less on runtime, at runtime implementations being able to figure out what is the best thing to do.
And some of the tooling proposals here, I think, can really ease that burden for implementations too. Like if there is a shared suite that you can easily upgrade to the next version of for compatibility, if tests for this are included in the conformance suite and you can opt into a newer version of that or a subset that includes like a new set or something like that, that could make it much easier to ensure and quickly move to stay compatible.
Yeah, I think that's definitely in my mind, what we're aiming for with the conformance test is that they are version part of the bundle. And when you bump the bundle version, you get the new version of the conformance tests. And that way, if you bump the version and everything, everything works code-wise, and you run the tests and all of a sudden some loosening catches you, then the test catch it, then you're great. I think Harry's right to say, well, there may be subtle bugs about loosening validation. I think we need to be really careful about loosening validation, but I don't think that there's any way to programmatically get around that. Like we are always going to have to be really careful about loosening validation.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we are at time, so I should wrap this up, but thank you everyone for the good feedback on this. Seems like there's follow-ups on all of the gaps we talked about today. I'll work on updating mine in the next couple of days, and we'll ping people after the fact. But certainly if you have comments on any of these, they're very appreciated, and we can continue the discussion on GitHub, Slack, or wherever. But thanks everyone for the great discussion here, and we'll talk to you all next week. Have a good one.
Thanks everyone.
Bye y'all.
Thanks. Awesome.
Cheers.
See you.